Let's break down 6 players that are set to go absolutely nuclear here in week 11 of the fantasy season. These are the players with great matchups, amazing upside, and the players you absolutely need to start if you want to dominate your league mates here in week 11 of the fantasy season. All right, we are kicking the video off with Rico Dowdle of the Carolina Panthers, coming off of a week 10 performance where he had 15.3 fantasy points, 18 touches, 53 yards on the ground, a touchdown, added 3 receptions for 10 receiving yards. So we liked Dowdle a lot last week. Obviously, I think for the most part, if you own Rico Dowdle, you are starting him regardless. But I will say last week was almost like a bit of a disappointment, I think, for some fantasy managers out there. Only 2.94 yards per carry against that Saints defense at home. It was a really good spot. He did manage that touchdown, but, if you were to take away the touchdown, it just wasn't really a great game. The overall volume was slightly lower for Rico Dowdle, but don't overthink it here. This is still a great spot on the road here against the Falcons. And I do think that the Falcons are going to have a lot of success defensively, that they're going to be able to shut down the passing game of Bryce Young and the Carolina Panthers, which certainly hasn't been inspiring as of late, but this Falcons defense is awful against the run. They can get after the quarterback. They're decent against wide receivers, very good against opposing tight ends, but they are just god-awful at stopping the run. They are now a bottom 5 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position after getting absolutely torched by Jonathan Taylor this past weekend. Now, Rico Dowdle has been great for the most part as the starter for the Panthers. He's no Jonathan Taylor, but this is still a great spot. And once again, he is a player that we can talk about in these types of videos because you got him off the waiver wire later in the season. You may have some depth at the running back position, although with the way the season has gone, you also might not. He might just be a bona fide starter, right? So just don't overthink this one. I know it wasn't the greatest performance last week, but it was still very solid, and this is a fantastic matchup. Even if the Falcons have a good day at home defensively overall, they are still going to struggle against the run. Rico Dowdle, a must-start player here in Week 11 of the season. Next up, we're talking about Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Just 10.4 fantasy points in Week 10 at home against the Patriots. 38 yards on the ground off of 10 touches, so just 3.8 yards per carry. Did have 5 catches off of 5 targets for 16 receiving yards. So we are now looking at 3 straight games for Rachaad White with 10.4 or less fantasy points, and can't really feel great, I guess, if you're a Rachaad White holder here. Although I don't know where Bucky Irving is, by the way. I don't know if he's ever going to play football again, but he is not expected to play here in Week 11, and who knows, this whole injury with Bucky Irving has been very odd, and like I said, I have no idea when Bucky Irving is ever going to play, or has anyone spotted Bucky Irving? Is he okay? Is he alive? I digress. If you own Rachaad White, it started off great, right? 23.1 fantasy points in Week 5, 17.6 in Week 6. He was getting that red zone usage. He was scoring touchdowns. And even this past week, Sean Tucker had some success running the football. He had 5.89 yards per carry, 10 total touches. But this was still led by Rachaad White, who was on the field on 72% of the snaps, compared to Sean Tucker, only on the field for 32% of snaps. But let's kind of get back to the point here, right? This is a great spot. Buffalo has been a bottom 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position. They really, really struggle. They've given up 12 total rushing touchdowns on the season. That is tied for the most in the NFL, tied with the Tennessee Titans for the most. And those are the only 2 teams in the NFL right now with double-digit rushing touchdowns allowed. This defense just got shredded by Devon Achane this past week. Now, once again here, Rachaad White might not be no Devon Achane, but he is getting the volume. He is the RB1 for the Buccaneers, and this overall game script is going to be competitive. We have 2 high-caliber offenses here, 2 of the better teams in the NFL. Very, very tight races right now in terms of playoff seeding as we start to get to the kind of closer end of the season, right? And ultimately, this is just going to be a competitive game, and I think that both the defenses here will not have their strongest performances. And we kind of look back at Rachaad White last week. It was a really tough spot. The Patriots are right now on a historical pace. They have not allowed a single running back to go for over 50 rushing yards on the season. We know that run defense is tough. Week 8, the Buccaneers didn't need to do anything offensively, so Rachaad White didn't have a big game because the defense was doing so much. I mean, even Baker Mayfield hardly threw the football. Week 7, it just wasn't their week against the Lions. They got game scripted out. So once again, this is going to be a great bounce back spot. If you're dealing with one of the 2 bye weeks here in the Week 11 season, if you're dealing with injuries, if you just picked up Rachaad White off of waivers, you got him hanging out on your roster, he is a very strong flex option or an RB2 option, and I think he could have one of his best overall fantasy days here in Week 11 of the season. Let's move along to the wide receiver position and talk about Jaylen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. 19.4 fantasy points in Week 10 against the Buffalo Bills. 7 targets, 5 grabs, 84 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Since Week 5 of the season, since the loss of Tyreek Hill, he has either had a touchdown or 82 receiving yards or more in every game except for one, which was in Week 7 against the Cleveland Browns. He's getting a very, very high amount of overall volume in the passing game. He's leading the team pretty consistently in targets. They're not really throwing anybody else. Some sprinkles of Malik Washington, whatever tight end is healthy, gets a little bit of volume. Then Devon Achane at the running back position gets some volume. But outside of that, it is just Jaylen Waddle. He's the wide receiver 11 in full PPR, the wide receiver 9 in half PPR. And he's a player that has to be in your starting lineup here in Week 11 at home against the Washington Commanders defense, now giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. They've given up a total of 13 receiving touchdowns on the season. That is tied for 2nd worst in the league, and they give up a ridiculous amount of receiving yards. Actually, now that I'm looking at it, they've given up the most receiving yards of any team in the league. The Steelers, the next closest. So this is a fantastic spot. And yeah, I think the Commanders will have some fight. And I know Dan Quinn is taking over, the defensive play calling and everything, taking that away from the defensive coordinator. But at the same time, it just kind of feels like slowly but surely the Commanders are kind of throwing in the towel, and this defense is dealing with injuries. Marshawn Lattimore, not that he was extremely impactful. We know he's probably not going to play. It's just a great spot for Jaylen Waddle. We just saw the Lions do whatever they wanted to against this Commanders defense this past week. So you got to feel good about Jaylen Waddle. You were probably starting him anyways, but he is a player that could have one of his very best fantasy performances here in Week 11 of the season and go nuclear. And Jaylen Waddle is my guy this week. I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Jaylen Waddle to score a receiving touchdown here in Week 11 for all the reasons we just went over. 2 touchdowns in the last 3 games. This Commanders secondary, god awful. I think this is a great spot for Waddle this week. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards NFL Week 11 action. Take that free Pick'em. Take Waddle to score a touchdown. If both of these lines hit, you'll automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, when you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH, as soon as you play through $5 on Underdog, you're going to receive $50 in bonus cash and a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH if you want to take advantage of all of their Week 11 exclusive NFL offers. Next up, let's talk about T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals, coming out of his bye week in Week 10, but the last time we saw him play, 33.1 fantasy points, 2 receiving touchdowns off of 9 targets. He had 7 grabs and 121 receiving yards. And here in the Unk Bowl Week 2 in Week 11 in Pittsburgh, he is now going up against a Pittsburgh Steelers team that we just kind of mentioned, who's giving up the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. 2nd most receiving yards allowed in the NFL, like we just talked about, but the most receptions allowed in the NFL of any team, and 8 total receiving touchdowns allowed on the season. So this is a smash spot for T. Higgins, who once again, for a lot of you guys out there, you are probably starting him anyways if you own him, but you may have some depth at wide receiver position, maybe looking at different flex options. T. Higgins has to be in your starting lineup. And we kind of look at it here, since Joe Flacco took over at the quarterback position in week 6, obviously that has benefited this entire offense, has benefited the two primary pass catchers in Chase and Higgins. But we look over the last 3 weeks specifically, the better performing wide receiver has actually been T. Higgins. Now, week 8 wasn't crazy. He only had 2 targets and 1 catch. Jamar Chase was a lot more involved in that game. And I guess he hasn't necessarily been the better performing wide receiver, but it's been very close. He's been the better performing wide receiver in terms of red zone looks and touchdowns overall in that stretch. The last 3 games, once again here, 1 receiving touchdown to Jamar Chase, 4 receiving touchdowns to T. Higgins. And what kind of has happened here is in a lot of these matchups, there's so much defensive pressure applied to Jamar Chase that T. Higgins kind of gets loose and forgotten about. And like you look back at some of these touchdowns, it's like it was barely any defensive pressure on him. So that has kind of shifted where we look through the first 2 games with Flacco at quarterback. We had 2 receiving touchdowns for Jamar Chase and just 1 to T. Higgins. But also important to note here, right, in week 7 with Flacco at quarterback, we got the Unk Bowl Part 1 against Pittsburgh. And in that game, both Jamar Chase and T. Higgins had a receiving touchdown, and they both had 10 or more targets. And Chase had 23 targets. So even with that, Higgins still had 10 targets in that game. So sorry if that was a bit, convoluted there, but still, overall, the point is there's a lot of passing volume here with Flacco at quarterback, and both of these pass catchers are benefiting. The run game is benefiting with Chase Brown. The tight ends are benefiting. And listen, we don't always want to go off of the last matchup for, divisional opponents. And it was just a few weeks ago that these two teams squared up. This game is on the road for Cincinnati in Pittsburgh, and that defensive line for Pittsburgh has been playing better over the past couple weeks. But like I've gone over, this secondary is still really, really bad. I know they moved Jalen Ramsey over to safety, but also they dealt with some injuries in week 10. So we could see an even more depleted Steelers secondary this week. And this is still a good spot for the Bengals. And you got to feel good if you own T. Higgins. He is a player who could have another monster week here in week 11. And guess what? You also got to feel good if you have Joe Flacco on your roster at the quarterback position. Obviously, also coming off of his bye week, but in week 9, 32.7 fantasy points against the Bears, 470 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns. He's had 2 or more passing touchdowns in every game as he starter with the Bengals, and at least 219 passing yards. He's also thrown the football at least 34 times in each of those 4 matchups, and in 45 or more in 3 out of 4 of those matchups. 18 or more fantasy points in each of those matchups with a ceiling of 32.7 fantasy points. So I don't think that Joe Flacco is a streaming quarterback. I don't think he's just like a super flex guy. He is a starter in single quarterback leagues as well. And also, after this past waiver period has gone through, he's still only sitting around 53% rostered at the time I am recording this. And in week 7, once again, we don't want to read too much into the past matchup for these two teams, but he had 25.9 fantasy points, 342 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns against the Steelers. So you got to feel good here if you own Joe Flacco, or if you're hurting at the quarterback position. He might be out there on waivers, and he is a great start. The Pittsburgh Steelers have struggled mightily against the quarterback position. Like I said, they've improved somewhat because that pass rush has been a little bit better in getting after quarterbacks, and the Bengals offensive line, that could be the case here in week 11 as well. But they've given up 15 total passing touchdowns, which is not the worst when we look at teams in the bottom 10 against quarterbacks by any stretch, but still a good enough mark. And they've allowed over 2,600 total passing yards, which looking at it very quickly here is bottom 5. Actually, the second worst, if I'm not mistaken, quickly looking at the numbers here, second worst in the league, only to the Washington Commanders in terms of total passing yardage allowed in the league right now. So this is a great spot. I really think that Joe Flacco has a tremendous amount of upside going into the week, but he also has a very, very safe floor. He's one of my favorite quarterbacks, believe it or not, going into week 11 of the season. Last but not least, let's talk about Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Can't believe we have to talk about a player like this, but let's look at week 10, just 7.7 fantasy points, 12 targets, 4 catches, 37 receiving yards. And I've gotten questions about Justin Jefferson throughout the week. I've had people say that they might bench Justin Jefferson for other options, and you don't bench a player like Justin Jefferson. I know it wasn't great last week, but outside of last week, he has given you double-digit fantasy performances in every game this year. I know he hasn't had a ton of tremendously high ceilings, 16.7 or more fantasy points in 3 games this year. Then we have 11.1 or more fantasy points in 5 games. Then last week, just 7.7, but still, JJ is a week in, week out starter. And I know, once again, the passing attack with JJ McCarthy at quarterback hasn't quite given you as much confidence as maybe when like Carson Wentz was in and he was just kind of slinging it. McCarthy has thrown for 248 or less passing yards in the last 2 games with only 143 in week 9. He also has a tendency to run the football a little bit, but outside of that, he is still targeting Justin Jefferson. He's still targeting Jordan Addison. It just didn't really result in a lot of actual catches this past week, which was odd. 12 targets to JJ, just 4 catches. 11 targets to Addison, just 3 catches. Then Jalen Naylor and McCarthy felt like they had a better chemistry, but he only had 6 targets, which resulted in 5 catches. Just a lot of receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. But let's not read too much into week 10. This is a great spot at home for the Vikings passing attack, for McCarthy, for Justin Jefferson, as the Chicago Bears are a bottom 5 unit against opposing wide receivers. They've given up a total of 13 receiving touchdowns. Once again, tied here for second worst in the league. They've given over 1,400 receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. They have only given up 95 total receptions, which is pretty good for teams in the bottom 10. That is the best mark in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, but still, this is a great spot. This Bears secondary is still dealing with some injuries as well. This is a divisional game, and believe it or not, the Vikings are still kind of on the bubble in terms of fighting for a theoretical playoff spot, which is going to be tough here. But the Bears are another team where, they're pulling out these wins by slim margins, and it's a really tight division right now. And the Vikings are not going to back down easy here against a divisional opponent is the main point. Vikings are at home. I think they're going to get it together this week, get Justin Jefferson the ball, and it is a great matchup. Once again, I know some of these higher ceiling games have been missing for JJ this year. I know this past week might be leaving you a little bit concerned, but don't overthink it. Justin Jefferson in a great spot here in week 11. He could absolutely pop off and go nuclear. Hey guys, have it. There are my 6 players set to go absolutely nuclear here in week 11 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comments down below, so please drop me any fantasy questions. As the week goes on, I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can. And while you're down there, it does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously when you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, go check out all of our other week 11 fantasy content. We have everything here on the channel that you'll need to absolutely dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.